Uh, I'm conscious that, like a typical soldier, I'm now the last man standing between you and a wonderful evening that is to follow. So I promise, I will not take more than 10 to 15 minutes of your time. At the very outset, let me compliment Economic Times for bringing together experts, information security officers from all across the industry for discussing a subject that has enormous implications, and I think touches all our lives. You have held extremely rich discussions over the past 2 days. Let me also honestly admit here that I am not a technical expert at all, and therefore I will make three key points which concern the intersection of cybersecurity with national security. Now, there are many aspects of cybersecurity and cyberspace that actually impact on India's national security. But as I said, I will flag three issues where I think the government and the private industry needs to work together in order to strengthen our cybersecurity resilience. All cyber threats are serious. Uh, they affect, as I said, they affect individuals. They affect the financial good health of your companies. They affect the reputation of your companies. And therefore, there is a need to find the best possible protection. However, when we are looking at national security and threats to national security, then the major threats come from state sponsored cyber attacks, where nation states are actually carrying out cyber attacks against the country. Because then the full weight of the state power can be applied. So, what they bring together is not only a whole army, as they say, of skilled people, but they also bring together uh, companies, hardware and software companies that reside in the state. And those companies also bring in their impact on cybersecurity, and which is why we are now saying that, let's look at Huawei and what impact it can have on our national security and cybersecurity, which is why China has banned Microsoft and Apple from all its offices. And they've said you cannot have these companies in government offices. So when you have state-sponsored cyber attacks, I think we need to look at them differently and take them very seriously. And in dealing with these threats, particularly state-sponsored threats, India has created organizational structures to protect our critical infrastructure. So you have the NCIIPC under the NTRO, which has been created to protect our critical infrastructure. And while this is absolutely essential, as we look ahead, and this is my first point, I think this distinction between critical and non-critical infrastructure is something that we need to seriously look at. And let me give you two examples in this regard. In November 2014, we had an attack, a North Korean sponsored attack on Sony Pictures. And what the hackers did is stole about 100 terabytes of data. They stole confidential emails, confidential data, and unreleased movies. And what was their demand? Their demand was there a movie called The Interview. I don't know if some of you have seen it. That the movie called The Interview should not be released. It was a comedy regarding the assassination of the North Korean leader Kim. So they said, you won't release this movie. If you do release it, we will in turn release all this confidential data that we have of Sony. So Sony buckled and they cancelled the premiere of the movie. Thereafter, it was a limited release, but the premiere that was to be held in America was cancelled. Now, there was a great deal of debate in the US administration about how to respond to this. One viewpoint was that, look, this is a commercial company, it's an entertainment company, and the government should not get involved. It is for these companies to protect their own cyber, data and their cyber infrastructure. And why should governments get involved? However, when the debate progressed, and even Obama was part of this debate, it was decided that this is an issue that involves freedom of speech. It involves freedom of choices. It involves our way of life. And therefore, Obama then publicly came up and stated that we are going to respond to this attack. A second example. And that concerns, software supply chain attacks. I'm sure these are things that you probably discussed, during your 2 days sessions that you had. The most devastating cyber attack in 2017, NotPetya, which caused about $10 billion of losses globally, was spread through a Ukrainian tax preparation program. So there was no direct attack on critical infrastructure. It was spread through a Ukrainian program which people used to use for making their tax returns. More recently, we have seen the SolarWinds attack in the US that compromised thousands of companies and government agencies. And one of the government agencies was Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. This is a company which is tasked to protect government federal networks. Why I'm giving you these few examples is, again, to reinforce my point today, what is critical, what is not critical. Was Sony a purely entertainment company? Can it be considered a part of critical infrastructure? Some tax software which people are using, can it be considered part of your critical infrastructure? And the point I'm making is this distinction is blurring, and we can no longer say, look, let's look at critical infrastructure separately and differently, and non-critical infrastructure separately and differently. Because if we make this distinction, I think we are only going to be sort of fooling ourselves and opening ourselves to vulnerabilities. And therefore, what is to be done? I think what we need to do is a greater level of cooperation between government and the private sector, and both have to play their part. Private sector needs to strengthen its cybersecurity, spend adequately, be more transparent in reporting cyber incidents. And the government needs to step up technical support to private companies. It has enormous amounts of technical expertise, and it needs to do that. It needs to quickly declassify threats and vulnerability information. There have been occasions where governments also hide the fact that some of their infrastructure has got targeted. And by hiding, you are actually increasing vulnerability to all the others. And finally, the government needs to increase its R&D expenditure on cyber threats. So this interaction between the government and the industry will go a long way in securing cyberspace. My second key issue concerns trust. See, in the last 1 decade, after the Snowden revelations, issues surrounding Chinese equipment, concerns about Twitter, Facebook, and other social media companies spreading information that could harm our social fabric, in some ways, trust between governments and corporations, trust between people and corporations has weakened. A lot of the processes that have been created by big powers like the US and China were created to aid mass surveillance. And I think we should just clearly understand this. And a lot of the private companies have aided governments in carrying out this mass surveillance. And that's one more reason why today when individuals look at these companies and say, look, how is my data being used? How is my data being protected? And there is a lack of trust. So while multinational companies need to look at national sensitivities, national laws, private companies also need to look at how data is being protected. Privacy is a fundamental right. The Supreme Court has said so. And if this data is not protected, I'm afraid people are going to lose faith and trust in companies. And the fact that today we don't have a personal data protection law should not become an excuse for us not to handle data properly. And finally, the government needs to clearly articulate a national cybersecurity strategy. Now, we have a national security policy of 2013, but in my personal view, a policy is a weak substitute for a strategy. So we need a top-down approach that clearly identifies threats, defines responsibilities, specifies objectives and priorities. If necessary, lay down timelines for actions to be taken. And in crafting this strategy, we should not focus merely on technical aspects, but also address the somewhat intangible social aspects. Today, fake news, misinformation, disinformation is reaching levels where truth has become a personal perception. I feel it's true, and therefore it is true. We have created these kind of echo chambers where it's difficult to distinguish what is true and what is fake. And while some are happy to exploit this state of affairs, ultimately, in a country like India, where there are existing inequalities, there are, social fissures that exist in the country. These small cracks that are there in our society could become a chasm that cannot be bridged. So I think we need to be careful about how our social fabric is being impacted. And ensuring that this does not happen, the ICT companies have a great responsibility. And I think we should clearly understand that. And now that I have come to 0000 for my time, let me end here by thanking Economic Times for giving me this opportunity to express some of my views, and to thank you all for being such patient listeners. My best wishes to all of you. Thank you very much.